Great. Welcome, everybody. We are going to just give a couple of minutes to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to get on, and then we'll be starting our program momentarily. All right, and I'll just ask anyone who is not speaking, we'll go ahead and mute our phones for the presenters as well until we get into the panel piece. So thank you. Great. Well, we have a lot to cover today, so I do want to make sure that we get moving into the program now. So I know some of you may still be joining, but we'll go ahead and get things kicked off. First of all, I want to welcome you. I'm Debbie Pope, and I'm the CEO for the YWCA Boulder County. I want to thank you all so much for joining us today as we really dive deeper into the struggle for voting rights for women of color. Black women have long been at the forefront of the right to vote, even when their vote was denied. And this is really a program today as we dive deeper into that, I think acknowledge that, and also recognize where there's still many challenges in voter suppression and how incredibly important it is to make sure that everybody's voice is heard. And today, 100 years after the passage of the 19th Amendment and 55 years after the Voting Rights Act, our fight continues. Before we get started today, and I'm going to share a little bit with you about the YWCA, and we're going to take a little bit of a poll with the audience, so to gain some of where your knowledge is going into this webinar, and then we'll have an opportunity to hear and learn more about our incredible panelists today, as well as be able to view a program together for about 10 minutes and then come back for a Q&A. But before we get started, our mission to eliminate racism and empower women means that we work towards right relationships with Native people. And today we acknowledge the Boulder Valley's history. So while many of us are spread across this country today, I am here in Boulder County along with some of our other panelists. And in 1859, gold seekers looked to the hills west of Boulder to find fortune in Arapaho and Cheyenne hunting grounds. 12 years later, the city of Boulder was incorporated in direct violation of the Fort Laramie Treaty, and the US government had with the tribes native to this land. In the words of Right Relationship Boulder organization, we want to acknowledge that the land where we live today is the territory of Hinona Arapaho people. We honor Chief Left Hand Niwot or Nawath, leader of last Hinona Band to spend their winters in Boulder Valley. Many Hinona people were massacred by the US Cavalry at Sand Creek, Colorado in 1864. The survivors were forced out of Colorado to reservations in Wyoming and Oklahoma, where most Hinona live today. In our daily lives, let us remember that the Boulder Valley is home to the Hinona people and to many other tribes that also camped, hunted, and traded here for centuries. And the Native people of many indigenous nations live here today. So the YWCA, our mission is to eliminate racism and empower women. Racial and social justice are at the heart of our organization. We've been doing this work in the United States for more than 160 years, and we've been doing that work here in Boulder County for nearly 100 years. The YWCA and our incredible community of volunteers, donors, and board of directors works tirelessly at our mission in really three core areas: racial justice and civil rights, empowerment and economic advancement for women and girls, and health and safety of women and girls. We serve 2.2 million women and girls across the United States through our direct services, issue awareness, and advocacy as well. So before we jump into introducing our incredible panel today, I do want to be clear that the YWCA is a 501c3. We're nonpartisan and we are not tied to any religious affiliation. But we are here to make sure advocacy and issue awareness is present related to the policies and fundamental rights like voting that make it possible for us to work toward a country where human dignity and respect is experienced by every person contributing to the United States. Our vote is our voice, and it will determine the future for us, for our children, for our grandchildren, and for generations to come. So for those of you that are joining us today, we're going to do a quick poll with the audience. So did you know that not all women receive the right to vote with the ratification of the 19th Amendment? And please be honest, so is that something that you knew about? You may have been hearing more about that now, but as you learned about the 19th Amendment originally, did you realize that? So we're going to give folks just a moment to answer that question. And then we'll see where our results come out. So we'll give it 1 second. And then Brittany, maybe it will show us what the results are. Okay, so about 71% of you knew that, which is actually a much higher number than what we normally hear, which is great, but still some of you joining us today did not realize that. And we really chose the topic today because we recognized this really powerful and wonderful quote that Gilda shared. It's important for all Americans to understand that voting is not a black and white issue and that it is not a Republican or Democrat issue. It is a fundamental democratic issue. So we have a lot to dive into today, and we have a powerful panel of women joining us to share their perspective, experience, and knowledge related to the women's movement and the fight for our most fundamental right, the right to vote. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you to the panelists, and we're going to start with Professor Gilda Daniels. So Gilda, just maybe wave your hand so everybody knows. And there's Gilda. Gilda serves as an associate professor at the University of Baltimore School of Law. She's a nationally recognized voting rights and election law expert. She served as a deputy chief in the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, voting section under the Clinton and Bush administrations. Professor Daniels has 2 decades in litigation, negotiation, and consulting experience in voting rights area. She's investigated, negotiated, and litigated cases involving the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the National Voter Registration Act, and other voting statutes. And she's the author of this incredible book you see here, Uncounted, Voter Suppression in the United States, that was released earlier this year in January. So Gilda, thank you so very much for joining us today. And then Teresa, wave a hand, Teresa. Teresa Younger is an activist, advocate, renowned public speaker, organizational strategist, and a proven leader in the philanthropic and policy sectors. She has spent over 20 years on the front lines of some of the most critical battles for comprehensive equity and the elimination of institutionalized oppression. And she now serves as the president and CEO of the Miss Foundation for Women. Prior to joining the Miss Foundation for Women, Younger served as the executive director of the Connecticut General Assembly's Permanent Commission on the Status of Women and an executive director of the ACLU in Connecticut, and the first African American and the first woman to hold that position. And Juni, wave there. We've got Juni Joseph, who's a Boulder City Council member, born in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, moved to the United States at the age of 14. Over the past 4 years, she's worked as the human rights and development field, where she's offered her expertise on transitional justice issues in South Africa, supported the mandate on the United Nations as an intern in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, and served as a Global Law and Development Fellow on a USAID project in West Africa, and most recently worked as a human rights officer within the United Nations mission to the Central African Republic. And Juni brings a wonderful perspective as also one of our elected officials here, but who also has seen what it takes to be able to get the vote out as well. And then Shireen, give us a wave if you can see and hear us. Shireen is joining us from California. And Shireen Raming is a former elementary school teacher, first-time children's book author, and mom of a young daughter and son. Here, I'm sorry I didn't continue moving here. She lives in Southern California with her children and husband. She immigrated to the United States from Belize as a child and became the first in her family to receive a college degree when she graduated from UC Berkeley. Shireen was inspired to write her children's book when she realized the lack of diversity in literature, and she wanted her own children to see representation of characters they could relate to. She brings an incredible perspective to this panel today as she recently became an American citizen who will vote in her first major election this year. So I want to welcome all of you. Such an incredible, powerful group. I know. It's just really, we're so honored to have all of you. And to lead us through this incredible program, we needed another powerful, incredible woman, which is Angelique Espinoza. Angelique is a political consultant and activist and has served on multiple nonprofit boards, such as Open Boulder, Impact on Education, the Dairy Center for Arts, and Boulder Business and Professional Women. She has served as a campaign manager for 2H Boulder Sugary Drink Tax in 2016, which passed, and was a 2016 candidate for the Colorado State House. She is on the YWCA Board of Directors Executive Committee member and also the chair of the Advocacy Committee. We welcome Angelique to get us moving into our program today and just moderating this incredibly important conversation. So Angelique, we will, and I'm hoping Angelique, we've got Angelique.
Yes, we do.
Oh, perfect. There you go. So I now put you all in the incredible hands of Angelique as we continue to move through this program. Thanks, Angelique.
Thank you so much, Debbie. Wow, what an awesome group of women we have here. And I really mean that as in creating awe. I am awestruck. I want to welcome all the panelists and thank you so much for being here with us today. We're going to view a short film. It's about 10 minutes. It's called The Ongoing Fight, and it explores the role of Black women in the fight for voting rights for all people. But just to set the stage, before we view the film, I'd like to throw a few questions to the panelists. Gilda, if you would indulge me on the first question I have, we've just commemorated a milestone last week of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, giving some women the right to vote. Why did so many women of color not receive the right to vote with the passage of this amendment?
Right. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here and for letting me be on this esteemed panel and participate in this program. The 19th Amendment indeed gave women the right to vote, but in fact, it actually gave white women the right to vote. For women of color, like my grandmother, who was born in 1919, the year before the 19th Amendment was ratified, the amendment had no effect. People of color in the South and Southwest were unable to register and cast ballots due to what Dr. King called all types of conniving methods, things such as poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clause, economic terror and violence prevented the exercise of the franchise. And if you consider people like Ms. Myrtle Pless Jones, who I talk about in my book, who was a graduate of South Carolina State University and got a master's degree from Michigan State University. She got married, lived in Montgomery, Alabama in the 1950s, went to register to vote and was asked how many bubbles on a bar of soap, right? She was a Black woman. She lived in the South and when she gave the answer of over 100, she was told that answer was incorrect and was not allowed to register to vote. So although we had the 19th Amendment, that was not enough. The 19th Amendment did not help her get the right to vote. It was in fact the 1965 Voting Rights Act that allowed women and men of color to exercise their right to vote more freely.
Thank you so much, Gilda. Teresa, thank you for being here. How is the voting rights of 1965 so crucial in ensuring all women and men have the right to vote?
So thank you so much for having me and bringing me from Brooklyn all the way to Colorado today. So it's an honor to be with everybody, and I'm thrilled to be on this panel with the other speakers. I have to say, Gilda has such a history in this work. I feel a little odd answering this question, but thrilled to be in this conversation. You know, one of the things that the Voting Rights Act Voting Rights Act of 1965 did is it really clarified what could and could not be done. It was very intentional about addressing some of the issues that Dr. Daniels just talked about in terms of what we could and couldn't do. You could not, you couldn't have a test. You couldn't, it lined up what needed to happen. The other thing, and it identified the barriers that people were seeing when they were going to the polls. The other thing that I think is really critical that the act did in 1965, and until more recently when it was not enacted again, what it did is it held government accountable for the monitoring of how people were able to participate in full democracy. And so it identified a monitoring process for states to make sure that they understood they were getting watched and that the suppression that was happening could potentially be challenged on the federal level for what states were doing. I mean, in many ways, we know that even the 19th Amendment was not ratified in Mississippi until 1984. Right? So it's not like states were rushing to have a great level of democratic and involvement in what was going on. And so what the Voting Rights Act of 1965 did is it was an intentional call out to the barriers that were being put out and an accountability structure that said to states, you can no longer continue in this way. And we will, through setting up departments of litigation, be able to check you. And it gave other organizations on the ground the platform to be able to pursue litigation, to ensure rights, and to call out some of the hypocrisy of what was happening in some of the states. And it wasn't all Southern states. This was happening around the country in a number of communities where there were large levels of racism. And so, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was critical in actually calling in also other communities of color into the voting process, because we saw both Native Americans and Asian Americans and many Latinx people who were unable to vote also because of the barriers that were being put up. So it was remarkable in what it did, and we are missing it, not having it renewed and back on the books.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you so much, Teresa. Gilda, I'm going to come back to you for this one. What is voter suppression? And what does it mean to be purged from the system? How can this even be done?
Voter suppression is a system of laws and efforts that discourages and in some instances prevents certain groups from participating in the electoral process. Voter purge is actually the practice of removing ineligible voters from state-compiled registered voter lists. And it's a part of the list maintenance procedure where election officials are required to maintain accurate voter rolls. What happens, however, is when eligible persons are removed from the voter rolls, that's when you have certainly voter suppression. And we've seen that there was a recent Supreme Court case, Husted versus A. Philip Randolph Institute, where the Supreme Court said that you could remove people for not voting. So if you have not voted in 2 consecutive federal elections, they could remove you entirely from the voter registration rolls, as opposed to placing you on an active list or doing doing some other means of maybe notifying you, hey, we're going to remove you from these rolls. But so that is a voter purge, and so purging people for purging eligible people from not voting is the problem. In the Ohio case, one of the persons involved in the Ohio case said, I don't lose my right to own a gun if I don't buy a gun. Why do I lose my right to vote if I don't vote? So purging people for reasons, purging eligible persons from the voter rolls is essentially the voter suppression tactic that is used certainly throughout the country.
Thank you so much for that. So now we're going to go to the film. Again, it's called The Ongoing Fight. It's about 10 minutes, and I hope everyone will enjoy it.
I brought my mother to vote at the Southside Homes Community Center, only to have been told after 60 years of voting that she had been purged from the system.
Even as the coronavirus raises new questions about the safety of voting, some Black Americans say they are encountering obstacles that remind them of the past.
I cannot come to grips with it, that my mother, my own mother, cannot vote after all that she's been through. She came through the civil rights era. She said, I have gone through many years where I could not vote. I want to vote, Cynthia.
The right to vote was hard-won for African-American women in particular, who played a significant and sometimes overlooked role in a struggle that cut across both the suffrage and civil rights movements. And they remain at the forefront of the fight to expand access to the ballot today.
You got to make sure you go vote.
Sheila Tyson works with girls in Birmingham, Alabama on civics education and political engagement.
We introduce them to the whole history of voting, how the state houses ran, how do you pass a bill? How do you get your brother, your church members, to actually participate in the voting system?
So we're going to register you guys to vote today. And we are educating people and letting them know the importance of using voting to exercise your right to state your opinion and have a say-so in your everyday life.
Because they always come on.
My grandmama quoted, she said, when you invest and educate a man, you have educated a man. But when you invest and educate a woman, you have educated a nation.
The work of the Birmingham students is rooted in a tradition of activism by African American women who came before them.
These are women who have a long history working together, going all the way back to the Civil War, some of them. They come out of a distinct history, a history that is not captured in a narrative about women's suffrage associations.
The long fight was officially over.
The campaign for women's suffrage celebrated the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920.
The suffrage movement was a long story of hard work and heartaches, but it was crowned by victory.
But that victory was not felt equally among all women.
My grandmother was born in 1919, the year that women were given the right to vote. However, she was African American and lived in Louisiana. She did not cast a ballot until the 1960s.
African American women, even after a constitutional amendment, will still be disenfranchised by state laws, by poll taxes, by grandfather clauses, by understanding tests, by whites-only primary.
So Black women turned to their own networks, including those formed through Black women's clubs, which had been organizing for decades on voting rights and other campaigns like anti-lynching. And now they dug in.
So how do you pay your poll tax? How do you confront an official who imposes on you a literacy test? This is the on-the-ground work that has to happen in order for Black women to see the results of women's suffrage in a meaningful way.
We was met in Indianola by policemen, highway patrolmen, and they only allowed 2 of us in to take the literacy test at the time.
Women like Fannie Lou Hamer, Septima Clark, and Diane Nash carried that fight forward into the civil rights era, facing violence and imprisonment in the process. It wasn't until the country was forced to come face to face with the reality of what Black Americans were experiencing that things began to change.
Hundreds of marchers heading to the state capitol in Montgomery to protest restrictions on Black voting were brutally beaten by sheriff's deputies on the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
America could no longer deny what was really going on. To see the utter brutality, I think, shocked the conscience of the country in a way.
After the violence in Selma, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law in 1965. It outlawed barriers like literacy tests and put places with a history of discrimination under federal oversight.
Since the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Bill, close to 1 million citizens in 7 states have been given the most basic right of citizenship, the vote.
Negro voter registration in 11 deep southern states has increased 50% since the 1964 election.
The new law meant that Daniels' grandmother voted for the first time, and that more black officials would be elected to office, including her father.
My father was the first black elected to the police jury in our parish, in Wynn Parish, Louisiana. And he was able to enter that election and certainly to get elected because of the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
And later, the Voting Rights Act came to play a role in Daniels' own life when she began working in the Department of Justice's voting section, which was responsible for enforcing voting laws across the country.
There was continuing work around ensuring that particularly people of color in the South had free, fair, non-discriminatory access to the ballot.
The Voting Rights Act required states with a history of discrimination to get federal approval for any voting changes to ensure they were fair to minority voters. Daniels remembers one time when they intervened to stop a polling station from being moved to a particular building.
The place it was being moved to used to be the place where the Klan met, where the Ku Klux Klan met. Certainly elderly African Americans would not enter into this building to cast a ballot or for any other reason because of the reminders of the historical past and because of the discrimination and pain, right, that existed in that building.
But nearly 50 years after the Voting Rights Act was passed,
Shelby County, Alabama says the law has outlived its time.
A Supreme Court decision undercut a crucial section of the act, effectively freeing states from that federal oversight. John Merrill, Alabama's Secretary of State, says the time had come.
The days that we have had in the past in Alabama and other states in the Union where people have attempted to take advantage of individuals by making it more difficult for them to participate in the process are long gone.
Merrill defends the state's law requiring a photo ID to vote, saying it can combat fraud. But multiple studies of voting across the country have found such fraud to be extremely rare, and opponents of voter ID laws say they disproportionately impact people of color, the elderly, and low-income voters. Merrill disagrees.
Nobody's doing more than we are to make it easy for people to participate in the process.
While some states have embraced reforms like automatic voter registration, many others have made it harder to vote.
Moving polling places, closing polling places, purging voter rolls are all things that are now being done without federal approval, and we're seeing the shrinking of the right to vote.
Now, with the coronavirus making the safety of polling places an issue, there's a new push to expand the right to vote by mail. But that's being fought by conservative groups.
State and federal officials now rethinking how to hold an election during an outbreak.
COVID-19 is exposing fault lines that already existed in many areas of the country in regards to inequities that exist. The fight to vote has always been about power. Who has it and who can get it.
Meanwhile, Black women have shown a powerful commitment to voting over the years, and they've emerged as a formidable force in elections.
And it's all about making people aware of what's going on in their community. They want to vote, but when you lose all hope and you don't feel like your vote counts, you got to make people understand you can control what actually goes on in your community.
In March, thousands gathered in Selma at the Edmund Pettus Bridge to commemorate the 55th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. Sheila Tyson brought young women from her student group to be there for the event. They plan to keep registering voters and getting people to vote ahead of the election.
Black women, we are strong and we are hard workers. And it's worth the fight. It's worth the work that we have to put in to make sure that everyone have an equal right to vote.
Powerful stuff. So thank you to all of our folks who've tuned in for watching that film together with us. I'll have a few questions for each of the panelists, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from our audience, our viewing audience. So Shireen, I'll start with you. You bring an incredible perspective as a writer and an individual who came to the US as an immigrant and became a citizen. What does the right to vote mean to you? And you're muted, Shireen.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hello? Got it? Okay. So I just became a citizen last year. So this is, I'm voting my first election, my first major election. I'm very proud of that. It means everything. My husband is an American citizen, and he often tells me stories about the fact that his mother was born without the right to vote. His grandmother lived a portion of her life without that very basic American right. And I think that the film touched on that. So it's not something that I take for granted. It is what makes me an American. It's the very first American thing I feel like I'm doing. I'm exercising that right. And it is, like I said, I'm not taking it for granted at all.
Thank you. That's powerful, Shireen. Juni, I'd like to go to you now. We've been talking a lot about voting rights. As an elected official, what challenges do you think are in place that may suppress voting or discourage voters from coming out?
Thank you for this question. I just wanted to acknowledge Shireen's response. I became a US citizen in 2016 as well, and registering to vote as well was something that I did. So I really appreciate what you expressed in sharing your story with us. So thank you so much. And thank you to the CYWA for this opportunity. And, you know, I thought long and hard about this question, and I thought to myself, you know, this may not be something that we faced as much in Boulder, but there are many challenges that, you know, people faced, especially mentioned in the video. For instance, I was thinking, you know, where polling stations are located, or even drop boxes, whether it's near police station or even near the courthouse. Think about it. And, you know, as Shireen mentioned, her own experience with becoming a US citizen, and for me as well, who was an immigrant, when you get the opportunity to vote, you don't want where you go in to be a reminder of the experience that you've had with whether it was with law enforcement as a minority. So I think these things are very, very important. You know, it's not just the hard, you know, polling stations are just closed, but it's where are they located as well. That's very important, because it has certain reminders. Because if you have to go by the courthouse or by the police station, and you've experienced discrimination when it comes to your dealing with the police, so you might really not feel comfortable about going into these areas. But I wanted to touch on to something a little bit different, a little bit more nuanced, because we live in Boulder. And in Boulder City, we can say, yeah, people have access. It's not the same where people, you know, in other parts of the country where polling stations are closed, or they don't have that friendly atmosphere to experience, to express their voting rights. But I can say to you, just to pivot that question, is that voter suppression happened in other ways, in socioeconomic and educational way. For instance, you know, even, you know, when we think about it, Angelique, you ran for city council and I ran for city council as well. And part of the discourse of running for city council, who will you be reaching out to? And I made it a very important part of my campaign to, you know, to get young people involved. But there is also that narrative, young people don't care, they don't participate, or in Boulder, because I'm speaking of my own experience, we don't care about renters because they don't participate. They're living in Boulder for 1 year. Why reach out to them? So we can talk about voter suppression in the sense of closing the polls, but also there are other underlying issues in our community that also suppresses people's vote, whether it's how we reach out to them as people who are running for office as well.
Thank you so much for that perspective. That's, yeah, that is a little bit beyond the obvious, but something we need to think about. Teresa, I'd like to ask you a question now. As we saw in the documentary, women of color have always been a force in the women's movement and in the passage of the 19th Amendment. With the intersections in the women's movement, how do you feel that women of color most contributed to the right for women to vote, even without receiving that right for themselves? And what did it mean for the women's movement and collective power?
That's a great question. Thank you so much, Angelique, for that question. One of the things that I want people to understand is that in the passage of the 19th Amendment, the conversation around what made up women's issues was very narrow, and that many of those suffragettes did not even acknowledge that racism needed to be on the table. So while women of color, particularly Black women at the time, were bringing to the table their lived experiences around lynching, their lived experiences around harm, their lived experiences on so many issues, many of the women who were working at that time didn't feel like those issues were real. And the question, ain't I a woman, was really because Black women couldn't show up as women or being Black. We show up in this space as our whole selves, which means we can't make a distinction between those two things. And our lived experiences were the very reason why we found it important to vote, because Black women had for a very, very long time understood that that's where power set. And so, you know, I think we need to understand that it really was in you know, during the passage of the 19th Amendment and even through today, the discussion about what makes up women's issues has to go to women's lives. And so when we define women's issues at the foundation, we talk about the issues that affect the lives of women and their communities. Because what Black women have continued to do, and do to this very day, in fact, our voting participation for Black women is higher than any other group in this country, is because we understand the impact that that vote has on our community and what that ultimately looks like. I wanted to just also call out very quickly that one of the things we also know were the words of Audre Lorde, which come to mind for me, which there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't lead single issue lives. And Black women and women of color have long time understood that we don't just get the right to vote on one thing, we actually bring the complexity of our communities, including education and housing and transportation, into the voting booth with us in the ways we look at that because of the suppression that has taken place over time. One of the things I wanted to lift up also was the Ms. Foundation just completed a new report called Pocket Change, How Women of Color Are Doing More with Less. It breaks down philanthropy's commitment to women of color in this country. Just as a baseline, you should know that philanthropy, while moving nearly $70 billion in grants in a year, only allocates $5.48 per woman or girl of color in this country. So when we talk about the fact that women of color have continually showed up, we have continually showed up even though there has been no investment and very little investment in the work that we are trying to do, both from philanthropy and from government in the positioning around that. And women of color-led organizations, particularly Black women's organizations, have also recognized the political power of voting. And in fact, there are very, very few women of color-led organizations in this country that actually separate out voter registration, civic engagement, policy and advocacy, and leadership development. In fact, most women of color-led organizations have multiple strategies to multiple issues and work on all of those things. And I think all the women on this panel today can fully see that. And so when we look at what this has done in the women's movement, is it's actually expanded the conversation to be most inclusive of women's lives and the impact that those lives have had. And it's women of color who coined the term reproductive justice. It's women of color who started the Black Lives Matter movement. And it has been women of color from the onset, the 42 years before we even got to the 19th Amendment. The very first conversations that were actually happening by women of color in their communities, recognizing and trying to show people the value of what needed to get done and what that would look like. And now we're seeing actually a leveraging of that power and what that looks like, as we're seeing more women of color than ever run for political office. When they run, they win. And we are seeing for the first time ever on a major ticket, a woman of color as a multiracial woman of color running for the vice presidency. And so when we talk about power and we talk about what it has done for the women's movement, what it has done is it's diversified the conversation to be inclusive of all aspects of our lives. And that has been critical. If the suffragettes in 1920 had decided to also advocate for poor white women, we would have gotten so much further in the conversation, and we didn't. It was about, even if we look at our Constitution, it was about landowners. And there needs to be an understanding that people of color, from the point of the Constitution, were not considered whole people.
Right.
Native Americans did not get the right to vote. They were not even recognized as citizens, and yet this was their country, right? AAPI community was actually written out of how many people from different communities could get the right to vote. So we have to be really intentional about leveraging our lived experiences into how we want to solve the problems, and it makes for a much stronger and more diversified community when we do that.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Teresa. Gilda, your family's experiences touched upon in this documentary. How did you become interested and active in civil rights related to voting rights?
Well, that was when I saw the question. I was like, "That's a very interesting question," because I grew up in rural Louisiana. I didn't know I was poor until I went to law school, when everybody around me told me that I was. Because it was a family of 6, and we lived on $20,000 a year. And folk were like, "Oh, how'd you get here?" Right? I was at NYU, went to New York University Law School. But I'm a graduate of Grambling State University, historically Black college in Louisiana, and I could see the inequities around me. Certainly, growing up in my hometown, where there was a set of railroad tracks that went down the middle of the neighborhoods and separated the Black community from the white community, and still does to this day. Right. So there were certainly inequities that existed, I knew that I wanted to be a lawyer. I did not know any lawyers before I went to law school, but I knew that I wanted to be a lawyer because I knew that with that knowledge that I saw that as a tool that I could help serve my community, and certainly the civil rights lawyers, Thurgood Marshall. So Thurgood Marshall was my role model, right? And so it's like, I didn't know any lawyers, but I knew it was like, if I can make those kinds of changes, help to make those kinds of changes in my little city, in my neighborhood, in my state, and certainly in my country, then that was going to be a life worth living for me. So I've certainly been blessed to work in the area of public interest and civil rights. I've represented death row inmates and done prison condition cases, and then I've spent the last 2 decades certainly working on voting rights issues, and having done it at the Department of Justice, which was certainly a blessing and an honor to do that, and seeing and being able to see the landscape and see how voting is an integral part. Right, and how certainly the African American community has always seen education and voting as essentially the pillars, right, that we can build everything else upon. And Black women have always been at the forefront of that, but certainly as a community, those two are certainly have been the focus of our efforts and the focus of our fight to ensure equality, certainly in this nation.
Thank you so much for that. Let's go back to Shireen. What do we need to do to educate future generations about the incredible leadership that women of color have contributed to this basic right? And why are these stories so important for girls and women to know?
We have to start in the schools. It's one of the things that I'm actually really passionate about, having a 12-year-old daughter. And even myself, I came to this country when I was 10 years old. And there are stories that I'm learning now or that in my adult years that I never knew about. And I ask why these stories are not being taught in school even today. Is important in the schools. And it is important for our girls to learn these things because representation matters, as we know. How else are they going to learn to be empowered unless we show them the shoulders that they stand on them? I try to tell my daughter about her African American history daily. You know, we all know about Susan B. Anthony, but many people still don't know that much about Ida B. Wells. I mean, we do know about her, but we often see that she's not as celebrated. So these are things that that I feel are really important. Like I said, education in the schools, and I try to do my part at home with my own children, but to empower them, and not just my girls, but the boys as well. I think that's really important that we get to that. Yes, it's important for our girls to learn to be empowered and embrace themselves, but we have to teach our boys to appreciate the women, the girls in their lives, and that education is so important.
Very true. Juni, what challenges did you see in getting the vote out when you were campaigning? And what tactics did you use to remove barriers to voting for your constituents?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think it goes back to what I mentioned about earlier. You know, when we talked about the lack of outreach, you know how we talk about food desert? We do have political deserts or political outreach deserts in our community. Because again, as I mentioned, you know, when you're running a campaign, you're thinking strategically, where do you want to reach out to people? And I did see issues with that. You know, how do you show up to someone's door out of nowhere and asking them to vote for you? So and then you've not done any type of outreach to them for whether it's years. So I think that's very, very challenging. And also there's a level of policy education that needs to be done at the door that is very difficult. You know, people are not well versed on the issues that are important to them. Sometimes when I go to the doors, it's like I have to stand there for an hour, you know, just briefing the person on, you know, on policy issues that are important to them in the community. And I think that's a big challenge. So there is a real disconnect between real policies that protect people and also the theoretical campaign policies or plans. Because, you know, when you think about it, when you run for any political office, you come up with plans and ideas that you want to put forward. But when you come back again to ask voters, a lot of times they're not really keeping up with all these different issues. So I think the level of education is a big challenge. You mentioned what are some of the what tactics did I use to remove barriers for the voting constituents? For me, I did my best to walk the streets in the neighborhoods. Not to highlight my own campaign experience, but I know that, for instance, there were days I was at the grocery stores at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I was the only person there passing out flyers. There were days I was like, oh my gosh, I'm the only person there and nobody's doing this, so maybe this is not very effective. But actually it turned out that it was, because I did win my election. So I did a lot of door knocking, a lot of, you know, going to different places to find people. So I'm very optimistic of the fact that, you know, you may not like everything that I said at the time, but I went out there and I talked to as many people as possible. So I think, you know, to close that gap, we have to educate people. I think that's very important. And I've gone to other sides of town where people are well-versed and well-educated, and in areas where, you know, strategically, where people say, oh, these people are not gonna vote. They're not really aware of what's going on. So I think, again, it goes back to that voter education. It is so, so important.
Yes, and thank you for spending so much time talking directly to the voters in our community, Juni. That is so important, and it's very much appreciated. Teresa, women of color were a powerful force in the civil rights movement and the passage of the Voting Rights Act. What are some of the stories we have not heard about the women leaders of the civil rights movement? And what does the Voting Rights Act mean for all of us?
A great question. I always say the stories we don't hear, and I'm glad in the video we got to hear about Glenda's stories, are the stories of my grandmother, right? My own grandmother, who and this happened in communities across the country. And I think sometimes we are expecting it to be the big names that sit out in front, but it's actually the women in our communities that are having the greatest level of impact. So it was women like my grandmother, who had actually been the first Black woman to work in the front of the store, and was also the secretary of the state NAACP, and organized her community and the buses for the March on Washington, right? So it's women like that who were willing to test and be strategic about how to make change happen in their communities, and who were also organizing. And we can tell those stories day after day. But, you know, I believe Shireen said this, which is, we don't know many of the names. And what I say to people all the time is, the standard history books are not going to give us the names, or they give us the one sentence. They don't give us the full story. And it is incumbent upon us to continue to be lifelong learners and educate ourselves. I mean, people have a vision or an idea around Fannie Lou Hamer, but do they actually understand that she was beaten? Do they actually understand that she spoke up and was a strong, strong advocate for education, not only voters' rights, but additionally, she was a very, very strong advocate for reproductive rights and justice, right? We oftentimes talk about, but don't really understand the stories of women like Ella Baker. And then we have misdirected stories of even Rosa Parks, right? We all assume Rosa Parks was a seamstress and she was tired and she sat down on the bus. That's actually not true. Rosa Parks was a seamstress. She actually was tired. It was actually a strategy. It was part of a recognition. It was part of making sure that women could be safe and not get raped when they were waiting for their buses, right? So I think one of the things we have to understand is these are not simple moments. These are not simple strategies, and they haven't just stopped. The initial strategies around stopping lynching when Black women and women of color were searching for their right to vote in 1920 are the same kinds of issues around safety that women like Alicia Garza were putting together when she was organizing Black Lives Matter, right? And so what we have seen is a continuation of this thread and an accountability to those in all of these movements to come together and to work together in what we're trying to do. And so when I looked at this question and I was thinking about it, one of the things I realized is people have to understand that things don't just happen. Because in this moment in time around COVID, people feel like the lights just got turned on and, oh my gosh, there's racial inequality in this country. That's actually not how it happened. It's been strategic that folks have been oppressed in this country. It was a strategic move to, to allow for the Voting Rights Act to not be, reconnected. The Supreme Court was very clear in its decision. And this idea that the Voting Rights Act was, didn't need to happen anymore is actually coming from a position of white male privilege that could take time off at any time they wanted to go and vote. It was not from the position of hourly wage workers who have to take time away from their workplace, have to worry about childcare, have to get in line, then are confronted with other kinds of barriers. And so we really have to recognize the intentionality around this suppression and oppression that goes on is very intentional. And this movement towards what we've been able to achieve thus far is very intentional. And we have to keep fighting for it every step of the way. And we're seeing that happen across the country.
Thank you so much. I have a question for Gilda, but if those of you who are watching our panel today want to start thinking about your questions and posting those in the Q&A, I can ask your questions as well. So go ahead and do that. And panelists, if you have questions for each other as well, just go ahead and raise your hand and I'll be happy to hear what you might have as questions for each other. And so while we're doing that, I'll ask Gilda another question, which is, what are you seeing that most concerns you about ensuring everyone has the right to vote? And could you share a few examples that concern you most in this upcoming election?
Can I first just amen everything that everyone else has already said? And certainly one of the things that you asked me earlier about what led me to this is certainly by upbringing in the Black church, right, and the social justice movements in the Black churches. So I feel like I'm in church today with all of this, because I'm in agreement with everything, particularly how we about telling the stories. And Oprah says everybody has a story. I say that everyone has a voting story. Certainly everybody has a voting rights story, and so we do need to talk. I was so happy that I had an opportunity to really talk to my grandmother about her experiences, and my father and my mother and my father-in-law and and others, to find out about what was it actually like. And one of the things I try to do in the book is to put a face on these experiences, right? To give firsthand accounts, which I thought were very important. And even as we're looking at voter suppression historically, if we look at it contemporaneously, we certainly have instances where we can look at and we can clearly see what the impact will be. I mean, we can go to the gubernatorial election in 2018 in Georgia, where you had about 55,000 primarily Black and brown people whose ballots were not counted because of Georgia's exact match, signature match law, saying if they, like, because we were a woman who did not put the hyphen in her name had her ballot rejected, right? So those kinds of, if it did not match exactly, then they did not accept those ballots as counted. So one of the things that certainly concerns me is that there's a lot of noise about vote by mail, and in Colorado votes by mail, of course, but there's a lot of noise about vote by mail across the country, because it is, even the CDC says that it's a method of voting that states should adopt in this era of this pandemic, right? And it essentially gives voters another opportunity, right? Another option to cast a ballot. So you can request, if you don't feel safe going to a polling place or utilizing early voting, request a ballot by mail, right? So you have voting by mail, where you can vote in your home, safely in your home, or another thing the CDC says is let's extend early voting to 30 days, right? There are some states that only have like a week of early voting. That's not enough. And we need more than that, so that we can cut down the lines and the time that people will be standing in line in order to vote. And then if people are voting in person on election day, then will we have adequate PPEs? Will they desanitize the machines? How do they desanitize machines? Will they have enough poll workers? What we saw for the presidential preference primary was a lot of poll workers who tend to be elderly said, I'm not coming up, I'm not showing up. And so you had polling places that couldn't even open. So it is August. We know that we need to make adjustments now, right? And we know that we need to extend, that jurisdictions need to extend early voting. We know they need to prepare for in-person voting. We know that they need to allow no excuse absentee ballots. All those things are things we know, but there's pushback, right, from primarily Republican legislators and governors, and you even have the RNC in a number of cases. There are a number of cases across the country that are fighting for those things to expand the electorate and expand the opportunity for people to vote. And there's pushback, but there, advocacy groups like Advancement Project, like NAACP, LDF, ACLU, DEMOS, MALDEF, and others are fighting to have these measures in place, but time is running out. So there's anything that concerns me is that we're running out of time. Advancement Project was in a lawsuit in Florida where we just settled the suit because, and in part because, why don't we concentrate on getting these measures in place? And because we could fight about them until October, and then the court will tell us, no, we don't have enough time. So instead of that, let's get these measures put in place now, so that we can actually ensure that people have options to vote. And the concerns about, one of the concerns that it came about in 2018 was voter purge is late, right? Meaning like less than 60 days before an election. And people were going to the polls and realized, wait a minute, what do you mean I'm not registered? I've been registered for 40 years, 30 years, 20 years, right? And so those are the kinds of measures, and polling place locations are being closed and merged. A lot of jurisdictions are using voting centers. One of the concerns about voting centers is where they have just a central location for casting ballots, is that they're closing your local neighborhood polling place. So the place where people could walk across the street and go to the school or library or whatever, that is no longer a polling site. Now you have to go downtown to the convention center if you're in a place like Louisville, Kentucky, where they closed more than 600 polling places to have one central polling site. Well, that sounds nice because because of the centrality of it. However, you need to also provide transportation. You need to have a buses to take people to these locations. So there are some things that people are doing to try to make it easier, that are actually making it harder, and certainly making it harder for economically disadvantaged people. And we need to think about, these changes, and certainly without the crucial part of the Voting Rights Act that required jurisdictions to think about how these laws were impacting people of color, we're certainly at a disadvantage, and thus we are now having to bring lawsuits where we're made aware of these issues. But these are all issues that we need to be aware of, and certainly need to continue to fight to expand the right to vote, so we can give some teeth to the 19th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, as well as the Voting Rights Act.
Great, thank you. We do have a question from our viewing audience. Bella Pope asks, what struggles have you all dealt with while trying to get specifically people of color to vote? So who would like to take that one? What specific struggles, or maybe we could even expand the questions. What do you think are the ways that we can most effectively encourage people of color to vote?
Can I answer that real quick? I have family members who are discouraged from voting, and I feel like I'm constantly having the same conversation with them over and over again about the importance of this election. We all have our opinions on which way to go, but I just have the same conversations over and over with them. But one of the things that I actually am seeing, I'm constantly protesting with Black Lives Matter young people out in my community, and I have never
We've got a little glitch, but hopefully the audio will catch up.
So hungry and so ready. Where they actually have areas set up where. Can you guys hear me?
Yes. So the last piece we
Okay, I'm
got
sorry.
was that you've been working with young people and that you've never seen them so hungry and so ready.
Yes, and motivated. They're out there registering people, their friends, they're going up to people on the street. It's very inspirational. And I think it was Gilda who just touched on the fact that we need more polling workers. And I thought it was a great idea to have these young people step in and take those roles. I think the NAACP is partnering with people like LeBron James and trying to get young people to get in there and become these poll workers. So I do see inspiring things happening, but yes, I have met people who are very, I guess they're not inspired enough, or they're not very excited about this election, but yeah, having the same conversations with them over and over again about why it's important to get out. That's been my experience.
Can I add that one of the struggles I'm seeing is voter fatigue? That people feel like, let's just vote already, right? Because they feel like it's been a 3-year election or something, right? That it's been much longer than, we're counting down the days now. It's like, okay, 70 days, 80 days. And people are just like, when are we going to get to? And I think people are just fatigued. And we're hearing about all these, issues that people need to be aware of. And we want people to certainly be aware of the issues, but the things that the issues that people are talking about are things that are directly related to the act of voting. Like we're hearing a lot about universal, about mail-in ballots, and then you hear the President of the United States talk about how it's rigged, and and there are certainly people who believe that the system is rigged. And I think one of the things that I tell people, when you hear people say, well, my vote doesn't count, why should I do it? And I particularly say to young people that, if you care about criminal justice reform, right? We're in them streets, right? In regards to George Floyd and as well as shootings that occurred just this week, right? And if you care about criminal justice reform, then guess what? In Georgia this year, you can elect the sheriff. In Florida, you can elect the district attorney, the person who actually charges the people who do these heinous acts, right? So if you care about criminal justice reform, then you need to register to vote, and you need to vote, and you need to elect, who the sheriff will be and who the DA will be, right? If you care about education, right? Guess what? You can elect the school board, right? So making it, instead of this top down, where folk are all so focused on, the presidential election, that, the work needs to be done, certainly work needs to be done on the federal level, but also on and I would argue more so on the local levels. And getting people to focus on how their vote actually impacts their lives and the decisions that are being made, and voting every time there's something to vote for. I don't care if it's the water district, right? Just having your voice heard. But I think people are just fatigued from just the constantly hearing about how awful things are over here, and I think people are just really fatigued that. So I think people are having the opportunity to focus now that we're closer to the election. I'm hopeful that people will certainly be more focused, and certainly the people I'm talking to say, okay, now we're here. Let's do this. Let's get it done. Let's participate, because election officials are anticipating higher than usual turnout. And let's hope that is evidenced in all communities, but particularly in communities of color.
I would just say the other thing I would just throw in there, I agree with everything that's been said, is that folks today need to understand that it's going to be a challenge to vote. And as much as there is fatigue, we need to make voting plans for what that's going to look like. If you're planning on going to the polls, if you're planning on working the polls, if you're planning on mailing in your ballot, whatever it happens to be, now is the time to start creating a plan and then talking to 10 of your friends to get them to be able to get their plan together too. And that way you can be in a pod of learning as we go through this. So you're not feeling like you're about it all yourself. And it allows you to really talk about what some of the barriers and challenges may effectively be. As particularly, you know, where polling places are, and with so many people unemployed. And I know this isn't as much of a problem in Colorado, but in other places it is a problem when you don't have the $2.50 to take the bus across town. When you don't, and it's not just you, now you have to take your children with you because they are not in school, right? Because there's, you know, we're at home learning. So I just think we need to really be also thinking about what that plan looks like, and then how are you organizing your community, your family, for how you can all be supportive in this process.
Great. Did anybody else want to Juni, did you want to say anything about this one? We've got a couple of other questions coming up, but you're welcome to jump on this one.
Sure. I felt like a lot of the things I wanted to say had already been said by most of the panelists. How do you mobilize communities of color? I think, again, framing is everything. And I think also that's probably part of my answer to another question. You know, it's not about candidate, it's about the voter. And that's very important, because when you're thinking about getting, you know, other people to engage, you know, communities of colors to get to vote, why should they vote? Why should they vote when they've had a dysfunctional experience with with all levels of government? So I think we have to approach, you know, our interactions with getting people to vote and telling them that here's why I want you to vote. Here's why it matters. Here's why your vote matters. It's not just about the candidate, it's about you. So I think it's very important that we frame the question when we are trying to get people out there to vote. And I think another thing is, I don't know if that is true, but I have the impression that, you know, people of color, they get the engagement that you matter and you're important during elections. And throughout the year, they're not getting that type of engagement. And I know Gilda just mentioned voter fatigue. I think actually voter fatigue probably happened in certain neighborhoods and in certain classes. And I think at some level, it doesn't happen at all. You only get the voter fatigue during election time. And people find that actually disingenuous. You're showing up to my door, you're calling me during election, but when it matters, when it comes to voting in the legislature, you're not voting for me. So at the end of the day, there is a disconnect. And I think we need to close that gap in order to get people more engaged into the system. And I think Teresa mentioned something earlier that I think that is very, very, very important. Because of the wide gap in the disconnect, and it's so hard to get people to engage, we have to do the peer-to-peer engagement. You know what? You believe in this idea. I've come to your door and I've talked with you. Can you reach out to your neighbor, to the neighbor to your right and the neighbor to your left? Can you do that and get that person out to the poll? And I think that's even more effective, because imagine someone who's working for a nonprofit or whatever organization to mobilize people. You're going out there and you're just trying to connect with people, and sometimes that connection is not happening. And the best way to connect with someone is to reach through someone they already know. So I think that's very important that we keep these things in mind. Yes, the message is important, but people are very skeptical these days of the fact that government has not worked for them. So we have to find other way to engage people. That's my response. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, I've sometimes called that with the Latino community drive-by voting. That they come into our communities when it's election time, and then the rest of the time we don't get so much attention. So we have 5 questions from our audience now, which is great, but I think we will want to just keep it to 1 or 2 people answering each question at this point. So from Heather, we have, what can we do as concerned citizens to protect the right to vote between now and the election? Who'd like to take that one? Maybe Gilda?
I'll start. So kinds of things that we can do to protect the right to vote. I ask people to do a few things: educate, legislate, litigate, participate. Right? Educate yourselves about the process, about the voting process. What are the deadlines? Where do you vote? Making sure that you're registered, those kinds of things. So educate yourselves about who's on the ballot and what are their positions, right? So certainly education is certainly something that we can all do between now and the election. And legislate, know what, it's just generally if there was a legislative session in your state, knowing what legislation is being proposed that will impact your right to vote, and making a statement about it, contacting those elected officials. We can certainly do that on the congressional level now, because there are pieces of legislation that would impact the right to vote and would give money to states to actually have PPEs, to have the equipment that they need to count the enormous amount of ballots, vote by mail ballots that they'll have to count, and for other measures. Litigate, there are organizations across the country that are litigating to expand right to vote. So partner with them, support those organizations like Advancement Project, like ACLU, DEMOS, NAACP, LDF, and a number of civil rights organizations. And finally, participate. Do the things that we've been suggesting, like signing up to be a poll worker for this election. And also register, go ahead, register people to vote, because during this during this pandemic, the pandemic that started in March, places where people normally would register, like the Department of Motor Vehicles, was closed for months. In the litigation we did in Florida, we talked to supervisors of elections who said that their voter registration was at zero. And this is in June, July, right? Because those outlets that people usually have were not being utilized, could not be utilized because of COVID. So we are behind in regards to registrations. Think of all those students that graduated from high school who would have normally gotten a diploma and a voter registration application. Guess what? Now you need to be the person giving them the voter registration application, or sending them the link on their phone so they can sign up and register to vote, because certainly students and young people are very important to not only this election, but all other elections. It's important to get them involved in the election process and certainly the voting process very early on in their lives. And so if we can do those things, those are all things that I think would be beneficial to do prior to this election, and also to remember that it's not just election day, that we need to think beyond in regards to making sure that our representatives, that our elected officials actually represent us, that the work will continue beyond election day.
Great. So the next question we have is from Alan, who asks, what is the right thing to do when an initiative isn't inclusive enough? Is it okay to make some progress when we know that too many others will be left behind? That's a tricky one. I don't think there's a right answer, but I'd be interested in hearing how maybe some of you feel about it.
I can just respond a little bit to, this idea of lack of inclusivity when it comes to whether it's ballot initiative or even policy. The thing is, we cannot, let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We know that, it's very unlikely that you will have a policy that just covers everyone. So we can't just stand in the way and say no. So we have to move forward. So it's always, I think in my mind, it's always better to move forward with what we have and try to perfect it over as we go along. Because think about it, because as a representative of constituency, if, for instance, the ballot measure helps out 80 and 90% of the population, and there's 10% that is not helping, do you just say, well, because this 10% is marginalized, we're not gonna work with this policy, or we're just not gonna vote for this ballot measure? Actually, how about the 90% that you could help? I think it's important to move forward with this 90%, and as you go along, you work really hard to incorporate the 10%. So again, we have to think about it's a balance. Policy is a balance, life is a balance. And remember, I think, as a local official, resources are limited. When I was younger, I used to think resources are unlimited. And the issue that we have is distributive issues. Yes, part of it. But we also have this limit, this limit to the resources that we have. So we have to learn to be creative on the distributive process. So I would say, yes, let's go with what we have and make it better.
Does anybody else have a different view on that they'd like to share?
I don't necessarily have a different view, but I just think that sometimes we have to not be looking for just the right answer. There can be multiple right answers in the moment and in the time. And one of the things that I spent 8 years working in policy in the state of Connecticut. And so, knowing when you were sitting at when does a baby step actually get us to the next step? And when do we think like it's all over? We're just going to stop right here. Or how have we organized? I think the assessment about when you step forward into something that's not perfect or not as good as you want it to be really becomes a complex discussion about how much more are you willing to do and to call out and recognize what's not right about what you're working on. And sometimes you do say no, but sometimes you do say yes. And I think there's a fine line, and I will just say I'm not sure, having worked on over 80 pieces of legislation, there was ever a right, but don't let the fear of making the wrong decision cause you to make no decision. I think that's really important.
Those are both really important and valid thoughts on this nuanced question. The next question is, how can we support other communities and states with Get Out the Vote efforts, especially the important electoral college states? I think our local community in Boulder and Colorado are engaged well, so I'm wondering how to help in those other important areas.
I'll jump in, and then I'm sure everybody else has thoughts. One of the things I always say is we are a mobile country, and we all have friends and family in multiple states. And, at least I know I do. I have, between friends and family, I think I cover, 2/3 of the country at this point. And so using social media, using phone calls, using opportunities to get to folks, reminding them, have they completed their census form? Start the conversation there. The census, you have to have your census forms completed by September 30th. September 30th gives us just 5 weeks to get our census in. So start the conversation there. Then ask about have they registered to vote? And so this is really, TV doesn't have too many new shows on, so use some evenings to host a call and have some conversations with your friends. I have quarantini times with friends, and we talk about the election and we talk about what needs to get done, and then inviting them to do the same thing. And I think, in those states where people, ask them to host things, be able to support what's going on. Everybody has challenges right now, but figure out how you can support some of those movement structures in other states. And there are a number of places who have prioritized some of the key states, the Voter Movement Project. There's different organizations across the country who have really identified target states. You can pull those up and be able to support, learn what's going on in those states, and they may ask you to make some phone calls. So.
All right, thanks very much. Here's a question from Carol. Do you think engagement is different for different age groups? Do we need to approach our different audiences differently? Anybody want to jump on that one? Go ahead, Juni.
I would say yes, right? Again, it goes back to the strategy that I talked about a little bit earlier. If you are dealing with a young person who's 18, you have to find out what is important to them. Why should they go out there and vote? Again, it's not about the candidate, it's really about the issue, and it's also about the voter, more importantly. Because again, I remember when I was running for council, I said to myself, You want someone to go out there and vote for you, which is, again, Teresa mentioned it. They have to, either they have other responsibilities, they have children, but they're gonna go out there and vote for you. Why should they do that? What do they get out of it? So I think you have to learn to frame, okay, for someone who's 18, think about it. What would be important to them? They're going into college. Probably college loan is something that is very important to them. So think about that policy and frame it. For a mom of two, what is very important to them? Think about it. Whether it's a better job, a higher minimum wage, someone who's 60, what is important to that person? You know, they're probably thinking of Social Security. They are also thinking about issues that's around age. So I think it's very important that we frame the issue for each group of people. And I know that's very time consuming, but we have to do it. And that's I think in my mind, that's the most effective way to get people out there to vote. They're not just gonna do it by you having some generic idea as to why it is important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, we are at time. I want to leave a little bit of time for our gracious host, Debbie Pope, to wrap things up for us. And I just want to thank all of you for being here, both the attendees and all of our wonderful panelists. I just want to give you a round of applause. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Debbie, to you.
Great. Well, Angelique, thank you as well. My gosh, talk about having a woman who's been at every level of, I think, this conversation. Angelique, you're such a leader in our community in this. So just like the perfect moderator for this. So thank you so very much. Thank you all. You are all so incredibly inspiring. I know I already have my plan to vote, but I'm rewriting it even after talking to all of you. Teresa, I already have my 10 people in mind. So all of you just brought so much to this. Thank you very much. And I want to share a little bit about every time we do or we get together and we talk about this, you know, what can we all do? What can next steps look like for us? So I just want to share a couple of things that we have coming up that can be ways for you to stay involved and engaged, and especially for our participants. One of them is actually, even before we get to voting, is our event we have coming up at the YWCA, the Dash and Bash, which is actually virtual this year in the sense that people can do this over a 3-week period, march, walk, run, and really all of the proceeds from this event directly impact our community as it relates to racial justice and economic advancement, health and safety for women and girls. So you see there where you can register, but here's the other thing, because we love bringing incredible women into our community. Dolores Huerta, who is just, talk about somebody who has been in this fight for all women. She just turned 90 and she will be joining us for the celebration that we do for participants on September 27th. So it's well worth it. And Dolores has even agreed to spend 30 minutes with those who are really engaged, who raise money for those young girls who are out there getting the vote out and doing work in our community. She'll be spending time with that group as well. So I want to put that on your calendar. And the beauty of it is anybody can participate across the country. So Teresa, Gilda, Shireen, you're all invited to join my team, even virtually. And then I really want to talk about, you know, your voice, your vote, your future. The YWC has partnered with Michelle Obama in terms of When We All Vote and their organization. So even just this piece here is a QR code that you can share. And it's really easy then for people to be able to register, for them to see who's in their district, all of those pieces when you talked about educate, legislate, litigate, right? And then participate. You know, these are really great tools that I think, especially when we're in the middle of COVID, you know, this is a way to be able to share this very easily in a digital way that's also safe as well. So, you know, and no longer can you hear the excuse, well, I don't know how to do that, or I'm not sure I'm registered. Oh, here, let me send this to you. So you can easily find that out as well. So I want to thank everybody so much for being a part of this today. I really want to thank the participants taking time and recognizing how important this is, and most important, for us to lift up the history of this country as it relates to how women of color have the journey that you have all had in this, and how you were part of the collective that gave my grandmother and myself, you know, the right to vote even before you had the right to vote. And that is incredibly important for us to acknowledge and recognize during this time, and make sure that all of our sisters during this time have no barriers in the way to be able to have their voice heard. So on that note, I thank you all, and I hope to see many of you again. Thanks.